On Christmas Eve, 2002, a quiet neighborhood in Modesto, California, woke to what appeared to be an ordinary winter morning. Homes were decorated, families were preparing meals, and wrapped presents waited beneath Christmas trees. But before the day was over, one house on Covena Avenue would become the center of a mystery that captured the attention of an entire nation. A 27-year-old woman named Laci Peterson had disappeared. She was in the final weeks of pregnancy, and she and her family were waiting excitedly for the arrival of a baby boy they planned to name Conner. Her keys were at home. So were her purse and wallet. The family dog had been found wandering outside with its leash attached. Yet Laci was nowhere to be seen. Her husband, Scott Peterson, said he had spent part of the day fishing on San Francisco Bay, nearly 90 miles away. At first, that statement seemed to offer investigators a simple account of his movements. Instead, it would become one of the most closely examined details in the case. Months later, the search for Laci would end near the same bay where Scott said he had gone fishing. A hidden relationship would be exposed. Recorded telephone calls would be played before a jury. And a case built almost entirely on circumstances would divide viewers across America. How did a missing person search on Christmas Eve become one of the defining crime stories of the cable news era? Why did millions of people believe they knew what had happened before a trial had even begun? And how did the names Laci and Conner become connected to a change in federal law? This is the story of Laci Peterson, the investigation that followed her disappearance, and the trial that continued to echo long after the verdict. Before the headlines, cameras, and courtroom arguments, Laci Denise Rocha was known by the people closest to her as energetic, social, and deeply connected to her family. She grew up in California and later attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. It was there that she met Scott Peterson. The two married in 1997 and eventually moved to Modesto, close to Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, and other members of her family. They bought a home on Covena Avenue, in a neighborhood near a park and walking paths. From the outside, their life seemed settled and promising. By 2002, Laci was expecting the couple's first child. The baby was due in February of the following year. Family members were preparing for his arrival, and the name Conner had already been chosen. Photographs from that period show a smiling expectant mother surrounded by people who were looking forward to a new chapter. That sense of anticipation is essential to understanding the loss at the center of this case. Laci was not merely a name in a criminal file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a mother preparing to welcome her son. On December 23, the day before she vanished, Laci and Scott visited the salon where her sister, Amy Rocha, worked. Amy cut Scott's hair. That evening, Laci spoke with her mother by telephone. Nothing about the conversation warned Sharon that it would be the last time she would speak with her daughter. Christmas plans were already in place. Laci and Scott were expected at a family gathering the next evening. According to the account Scott later gave police, he last saw Laci at their home on the morning of December 24. He said she planned to do household chores and possibly walk their golden retriever, Mackenzie. Scott said he left to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. The distance between Modesto and the marina meant he would be gone for much of the day. That morning, a neighbor found Mackenzie outside, still attached to his leash, and returned him to the Peterson property. At the time, the moment may have seemed unusual but not alarming. Only later would it become a fixed point in a timeline that investigators, attorneys, witnesses, and viewers would debate for years. When Scott returned to Modesto that afternoon, he said Laci was not home. He telephoned Sharon Rocha and asked whether Laci was with her. She was not. Family members began calling one another, checking likely locations, and searching the area. Before 6 that evening, Laci had been reported missing. Christmas Eve changed instantly for the Rocha and Peterson families. Plans for celebration gave way to urgency. Police arrived at the Covena Avenue home and began asking questions. Laci's personal belongings had been left behind, including items she would normally carry if she had chosen to go somewhere. Her pregnancy made the situation even more concerning. There was no known reason for her to cut off contact with the family she spoke to regularly. The first searches focused on the neighborhood and nearby park. Relatives, friends, police officers, firefighters, and volunteers walked streets, inspected paths, distributed flyers, and called hospitals. Search dogs and aircraft were used as authorities expanded the effort. A volunteer center was created to organize information and receive tips. Blue and yellow ribbons appeared around Modesto. People who had never met Laci gave their time because they wanted to help bring a pregnant woman home. But as hours became days, detectives began examining more than the places Laci might have gone. They began examining the people closest to her and testing the stories they were told. This was standard investigative work, not proof that anyone was guilty. Scott cooperated with early questioning and told detectives about his trip to the Berkeley Marina. He said he had taken a recently purchased boat onto the bay and fished near Brooks Island. He produced a marina parking receipt that supported his presence there that day. Yet questions quickly followed. The boat had been purchased only weeks earlier, and several people close to Scott did not know he owned it. Investigators searched the warehouse where he stored it. They also studied his computers, vehicles, telephone records, and financial activity. None of those facts alone established murder. But detectives were beginning to assemble a picture from many small pieces, and the picture was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then, less than a week after Laci disappeared, a woman contacted the police. Her name was Amber Frey. What she told investigators would completely change the direction of the case and the way the public viewed Scott Peterson. Amber Frey told investigators that she had begun a relationship with Scott in November 2002. According to her account, Scott had presented himself as unmarried. She said she did not know about Laci when they met. After recognizing Scott in news reports about the missing woman, Amber contacted authorities and agreed to cooperate. One detail was especially disturbing to investigators. Amber said that before Laci disappeared, Scott had told her that he had lost his wife and would be spending his first Christmas without her. Prosecutors would later argue that this statement showed Scott was imagining, or planning, a future in which Laci was gone. The defense would warn against treating a lie told during an affair as direct proof of murder. That distinction would become central to the trial. With police guidance, Amber recorded later telephone conversations with Scott. In some of those calls, Scott continued to mislead her while public searches for Laci were underway. During one conversation, he claimed to be traveling abroad even though he was in California. To prosecutors, the recordings revealed a man calmly maintaining a separate invented life while his pregnant wife was missing. To the defense, they revealed dishonesty and infidelity, but still did not explain how, when, or where Laci had been killed. When Amber publicly acknowledged the relationship in January 2003, interest in the case exploded. Television crews crowded into Modesto. Every press conference was analyzed. Every movement, expression, and rumor seemed to become material for another broadcast. Scott's affair caused many viewers to decide that they understood his character. But character and criminal guilt are not the same legal question. A courtroom requires evidence proving a charge beyond a reasonable doubt. Meanwhile, the search continued. Authorities examined areas around Modesto and turned increasing attention toward San Francisco Bay. Divers and sonar teams searched difficult water under difficult conditions. The location mattered because Scott had placed himself there on the day of Laci's disappearance. Prosecutors would eventually argue that his fishing trip was not an innocent outing, but part of a plan to conceal the crime. Scott denied harming Laci and maintained that he had simply gone fishing. Winter passed, and no confirmed trace of Laci was found. Her family continued speaking publicly, hoping attention would produce the one tip that brought her home. But in April 2003, nearly 4 months after she disappeared, the case reached the outcome everyone had feared. And the place where the discovery occurred would make Scott's Christmas Eve trip more important than ever. On April 13, remains of an unborn baby were discovered along the eastern shoreline of San Francisco Bay. The following day, the remains of an adult woman were found nearby. Authorities used DNA testing to confirm that they were Laci and Conner. After months of uncertainty, the search was over. For the family, hope was replaced by grief. For investigators, a missing person case was now a homicide investigation. The location was near the broad area where Scott said he had taken his boat on Christmas Eve. That did not, by itself, prove he had committed a crime. But it gave prosecutors a geographical link connecting his movements to the eventual discovery. Investigators accelerated their efforts to locate him. On April 18, Scott was arrested in the San Diego area. Police noted that he had changed his appearance and had cash, clothing, multiple phones, and other belongings in his vehicle. Prosecutors interpreted those circumstances as possible preparation to flee. Scott's family and defense offered innocent explanations, including that he was avoiding overwhelming media attention and staying near relatives. As with many details in this case, the same facts were placed inside two completely different stories. Scott was charged with 2 counts of murder. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecution accused him of murdering Laci and causing the death of Conner. The defense insisted that investigators had focused too quickly on an unfaithful husband while failing to solve the actual crime. From that moment forward, the legal contest would turn on circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness who testified to seeing Scott kill Laci. There was no confession. Prosecutors could not establish a precise cause of death. They did not present a murder weapon. What they did present was a sequence of behavior, timing, physical evidence, and statements that they argued could lead to only one reasonable conclusion. The defense would challenge each piece and argue that suspicion had been mistaken for proof. Because publicity in Modesto had become so intense, the trial was moved to San Mateo County. Jury selection itself became a major undertaking. Potential jurors had already heard months of coverage about the affair, the searches, the bodies, and the arrest. The court needed people who could set those reports aside and decide the case using evidence presented in court. In June 2004, opening statements began. Outside the courthouse, television cameras waited every day. Inside, 2 opposing explanations of Laci's disappearance were about to be tested. The prosecution's case was not built around one dramatic piece of evidence. It was built like a chain, with each circumstance intended to strengthen the next. Prosecutors argued that Scott wanted freedom from the responsibilities of marriage and approaching fatherhood, while continuing his new relationship with Amber. They used his lies to Amber to suggest that he had already created a future without Laci. They focused heavily on the boat. Scott had bought it in December, shortly before Laci vanished, and kept it at his warehouse. Several family members and friends did not know about the purchase. Computer activity showed searches related to boats, ramps, currents, and the bay. On Christmas Eve, Scott drove from Modesto to the Berkeley Marina and said he went fishing near Brooks Island. Months later, Laci and Conner were found along the bay shoreline. Prosecutors argued that the alignment of date, location, and secrecy was not coincidence. A hair recovered from a pair of pliers in the boat was compared through mitochondrial DNA testing with hair from Laci's brush. The prosecution treated that evidence as another link between Laci and a boat they said she had not known about. The defense questioned the significance and reliability of that comparison and offered testimony suggesting Laci may have visited the warehouse while the boat was there. Prosecutors also presented evidence related to concrete. A homemade anchor was found in the boat, and investigators observed marks and residue at the warehouse. The state argued that Scott could have made additional anchors to weigh something down in the bay. No additional anchors were recovered. The defense said the claim was speculation and argued that the available material had innocent uses. Then came the recorded calls with Amber. Jurors heard Scott continuing the relationship while volunteers searched for Laci. They heard false stories about where he was and what he was doing. The prosecution argued that those lies revealed consciousness of guilt in an effort to preserve the life he wanted after Laci was gone. The defense answered that adultery could make Scott morally unpopular, but it could not fill the gaps in the state's forensic case. The prosecution also pointed to Scott's conduct after the disappearance. Witnesses described discussions involving the Peterson home and Laci's vehicle. His appearance and the belongings found when he was arrested became part of the state's claim that he was preparing to escape. Each individual act could be explained, but prosecutors asked jurors to stop viewing the acts individually. Look at the complete pattern, they urged. A secret relationship. A prediction of life without a wife. A hidden boat. A Christmas Eve trip to the bay. And, months later, the discovery of Laci and Conner near that same body of water. It was a powerful narrative. But the defense was about to argue that a powerful narrative is not necessarily the truth. Scott's defense attorney, Mark Garagos, attacked the investigation as incomplete and overly focused on one suspect. The defense emphasized what the prosecution could not prove. No one could state with certainty exactly when Laci died. No one could establish the location or method of the killing. No witness had seen Scott transport Laci to the marina. And no definitive forensic evidence placed her inside the boat on Christmas Eve. The defense argued that Laci may have left the house after Scott departed. Several people reported seeing a pregnant woman walking in the neighborhood that morning. The defense suggested some of those witnesses could have seen Laci. Prosecutors challenged the timing, descriptions, and reliability of the sightings, noting that other pregnant women also walked in the area. The jurors had to decide whether those reports created reasonable doubt or simply reflected the confusion common in a heavily publicized missing person case. The defense also directed attention toward a burglary across the street from the Peterson home. It proposed that Laci might have encountered people connected to that crime and been harmed after Scott left. Authorities disputed the defense timeline and argued that the burglary occurred later. No one was convicted of harming Laci in connection with that burglary. The alternate theory became one of the case's longest-running points of controversy. Garagos argued that once police learned about Scott's affair, they interpreted nearly everything through an assumption of guilt. A fishing trip became a disposal mission. Concrete became evidence of missing anchors. A change in appearance became an escape plan. The defense asked whether investigators had built their theory from evidence or selected evidence to support a theory they already believed. Another issue was the intense media environment surrounding the trial. Commentators debated testimony almost as soon as witnesses left the stand. Legal analysts scored each day as though the proceeding were a contest. Viewers learned about evidence through headlines and short television segments, often stripped of the caution and context required in court. The jury was ordered to rely only on admissible evidence, but the larger culture surrounding the case had already transformed Scott into a symbol of the deceptive husband. The defense did not have to prove who else committed the crime. Under American law, the burden remained on the prosecution. If a reasonable explanation consistent with innocence remained, jurors were required to acquit. But reasonable doubt does not mean every imaginable doubt. The state did not need a video, confession, or eyewitness if the combined circumstances proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After months of testimony, the case came down to that question. Were the missing pieces signs of an unsolved mystery? Or did the evidence form a single chain pointing back to Scott? In November 2004, the jury began deliberating. By then, the trial had experienced its own complications, including the replacement of jurors during the proceedings. Every delay triggered another wave of speculation outside the courthouse. Then, on November 12, the verdict was announced. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci and second-degree murder for the death of Conner. The jury had accepted the prosecution's circumstantial case. It concluded that the combined evidence proved Scott's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even though the exact manner of the crime remained unknown. For Laci's family, the verdict provided legal accountability, but it could not restore what had been taken. During the sentencing process, family members spoke about Laci, Conner, and the future that would never arrive. The court originally sentenced Scott to death in 2005. He continued to maintain his innocence and pursued appeals. The legal story did not end with that sentence. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court upheld Scott's murder convictions. However, it overturned his death sentence because the trial court had improperly dismissed some prospective jurors based on their general objections to capital punishment without adequately determining whether they could follow the law. This ruling did not declare Scott innocent. It did not order a new guilt trial. It addressed errors in selecting the jury for the penalty phase. In December 2021, Scott was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later efforts to obtain a new trial continued to raise arguments about juror conduct and evidence, keeping the case in the public eye. But the convictions affirmed by the California Supreme Court remained in place. The verdict continues to generate debate because the case was circumstantial. Some people see the timeline, the lies, the boat, and the location of the discoveries as an overwhelming pattern. Others focus on the unanswered forensic questions and alternate leads. In law, however, a circumstantial case is not automatically weaker than a case based on direct testimony. Jurors may draw reasonable conclusions from proven facts. In this trial, 12 jurors concluded that those facts established guilt. Yet the courtroom outcome explains only part of why the Peterson case became historically important. To understand its wider impact, it is necessary to look beyond the courthouse and toward the television screens that carried the story into millions of homes. By the early 2000s, round-the-clock cable news had changed how Americans experienced major criminal cases. Networks needed continuous updates, even when investigations produced no meaningful development for days. The disappearance of Laci Peterson arrived in that environment with elements that attracted sustained public attention: a pregnant woman missing on Christmas Eve, a husband with a secret relationship, a massive search, and an investigation stretching across months. Reporters established a constant presence in Modesto. Press conferences were broadcast live. Former detectives, lawyers, and behavioral experts filled hours of programming with analysis. When confirmed information was limited, speculation often occupied the space. Anonymous claims could become headlines before they were tested. Ordinary actions were interpreted as signs of innocence or guilt. This coverage helped keep Laci's name visible and brought volunteers and tips to the search. National attention can be valuable when a person is missing. But it also created serious problems. Potential jurors were exposed to information that might never be admitted in court. The people involved became public characters rather than complex human beings. And the audience was encouraged to treat a real family's tragedy as an unfolding mystery series. The case demonstrated how quickly moral judgment could blend with legal judgment. Once Scott's affair became public, many viewers saw his dishonesty as proof that he was capable of murder. Others reacted against the coverage and assumed that media hostility meant the prosecution must be wrong. Neither reaction is a substitute for evaluating evidence. A person may behave terribly without committing the charged crime. And unfair publicity does not necessarily make a conviction factually incorrect. The challenge is to hold both ideas at once. The accused has a right to a fair trial. The victims deserve not to be reduced to background figures in a story about the accused. Facts must be separated from rumor. Evidence must be separated from entertainment. In the years that followed, true crime coverage expanded across television, podcasts, documentaries, and social media. The Peterson case became an early example of the pattern. A disappearance becomes national news, daily analysis creates competing camps, and new productions repeatedly reopen the debate. Each retelling has the power to inform, but also the responsibility to avoid turning real loss into spectacle. And while the media examined every angle of the trial, the names Laci and Conner were also being spoken in Washington, where Congress was debating a federal law with consequences far beyond this single case. On April 1, 2004, President George W. Bush signed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. Supporters also called it Laci and Conner's Law. The legislation recognizes an unborn child as a separate legal victim when injured or killed during certain federal crimes of violence against a pregnant woman. The law requires careful explanation. It applies to specified federal offenses and conduct under federal jurisdiction. It includes explicit exceptions, including for legal abortion, medical treatment, and actions of the pregnant woman herself. It did not create the charges used against Scott Peterson, because his prosecution occurred under California law. California already allowed a murder charge involving a fetus under its own criminal statute. The federal proposal had existed in earlier forms before Laci disappeared. But her case gave the debate a nationally recognized face and a pair of names that supporters used to argue that violence against a pregnant woman can produce more than one victim. Laci's mother supported the legislation and attended the signing ceremony. The law's passage became one of the most direct public policy legacies associated with the case. The measure was also controversial. Supporters described it as a way to recognize the full harm caused during violent federal crimes. Critics worried about how its language could affect broader legal debates concerning pregnancy and reproductive rights. The final statute contained exceptions intended to define its criminal scope. Whatever position people took, the debate showed how one widely known criminal case could influence national legislation. But laws and headlines should not become the only way Laci is remembered. Famous cases often become shorthand. A victim's name becomes attached to a statute, a documentary, or a legal principle. Over time, the person can disappear behind the symbol. That is especially possible here because so much coverage centered on Scott, his statements, his relationship with Amber, his behavior, his defense, and his appeals. Yet the story began with Laci. It began with a family expecting her at Christmas. It began with a mother waiting for her daughter to answer the telephone and with relatives preparing to welcome a baby named Conner. The investigation and trial mattered because two anticipated lives were gone and because those left behind demanded answers. That human truth can be lost when a case becomes entertainment. It is also the most important truth to preserve. More than 2 decades after Christmas Eve 2002, the Peterson case remains part of American public memory. Its facts have been revisited in books, television specials, interviews, podcasts, and legal filings. Each new examination returns to the same unresolved details. The exact time and manner of Laci's death were never established at trial. No eyewitness described the crime. And Scott has continued to deny killing Laci and Conner. At the same time, the legal record is clear. A jury convicted him of both murders. The California Supreme Court upheld those convictions after reviewing the case. Its decision to reverse the death sentence concerned jury selection in the penalty phase, not a finding that the evidence was insufficient to establish guilt. Scott's current sentence resulted from that distinction: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case leaves several lessons. First, circumstantial evidence can be powerful when many independently established facts point toward the same conclusion. Second, investigators must still examine alternate leads carefully, because early assumptions can shape every decision that follows. Third, public attention can help a search while simultaneously threatening the fairness of a future trial. And finally, a compelling television narrative is never a replacement for the disciplined work of a courtroom. For viewers, responsible attention means resisting the urge to treat tragedy as a puzzle designed for our amusement. It means remembering that rumors can damage real people. It means recognizing the difference between allegations, arguments, verdicts, and proven facts. And it means placing victims at the center of their own stories. On the morning Laci disappeared, her family expected to see her within hours. They expected Christmas dinner, conversation, and the familiar excitement surrounding the baby who would soon arrive. Instead, they entered a search that lasted nearly 4 months, a trial that consumed another year, and a public story that has lasted for decades. The nation remembers the hidden boat, the recorded calls, the crowded courthouse, and the verdict. But beneath all of those details is a quieter image, an unfinished family celebration, with 2 places that could never be filled. That is why the story still matters. Not because it produced endless television debate, but because behind every headline was a daughter named Laci, a child named Conner, and a family whose future changed on Christmas Eve. The cameras eventually moved on. The legal arguments continued. The law entered the federal record. But for the people who loved Laci and waited for Conner, this was never simply a famous case. It was their life. And that is the part no retelling should ever forget.